when the Prophet brought the teaching of Islam, he brought a teaching of equality, where the rich and poor were now equal. Men and women had an equal status in society.
He was telling the world two things. One was how to treat daughters with respect and how to respect women in general, and also the fact that in times to come, he will be indebted to Fatima and her progeny for the propagation and survival of his divine message. The message of love, of equality, of justice, of peace, not a message of what Islam has now is interpreted to be.
At a very young age, she accomplished so much. In 18 years of life, we find that she leaves a legacy like none other. She is one woman who is the axis between both imamat and nabuwat.
To have someone like Fatima Zahra is a treasure. It's really something that, instead of having it only in books and words, and you should be like this, and you should aspire to be so, when you actually see a person becoming like that, it really encourages you and tells you that this is possible. It's possible to be generous like Fatima. It's possible to be wise like Fatima. It's possible to be firm in faith like Fatima.
O people, know that I am Fatima, and my father is Muhammad. I will say that repeatedly and continuously. I do not say what I am saying mistakenly, nor do I do what I do aimlessly. A messenger has come to you from among yourselves. So if you know him and you know who he is, you will see that he is my father, not the father of any of your women.
Fatima is the highest woman in knowledge, purity, patience, and piety that history has ever known. She was brought up in the house of revelation and grew up in the lap of the greatest prophet, and thus she was the vessel of imamat and the continuity of prophethood. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi put Fatima alayhi salam in the highest place and most honorable position in Islam, to be the highest example for the women of his nation, not in chastity and abstinence only, but to play her role in the inclusive reformation if his ummah would go astray. She got married to Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam and lived with him a life of simplicity, and so she was an ideal example for Muslim women, or indeed for all Muslims. However, fate willed for her that she would not live after her father's death but for a short time, because of the oppression and harm she met from the people, though the Prophet had said about her, "Fatima is apart from me, whoever harms her harms me." But people denied the truth, deviated from the path of the mission, and turned Imam Ali away from his position of imamat, and Fatima left this world angry of those who denied the will of her father, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi.
Fatima al-Zahra was born in a difficult time when women were traded as goods, where they were disrespected, and also when men did not see women as a source of either education or inspiration.
Pre-Islamic Arabia was a very unfair, unequal society. Women had no status whatsoever in pre-Islamic time. For example, women could not inherit. In fact, women were inherited themselves. When a man died, his children would inherit their mother.
Because women were not considered as human beings by the Quraysh, the Arabs of the time. They counted them as amongst the cattle. I mean, women were more important than the cattle, but cattle was also very important.
They were categorized as cattle. They were seen as nothing more than a vessel of desire for men. They didn't even have the right of inheritance. And when it comes to pre-Islamic Arabia and their concepts of marriage, we find that they weren't following any law that was in vogue at the time. Men were allowed to have as many wives as they wanted. Women were subjugated to a lot of torment by their husbands in order to give up their right of dowry.
They would trade their sons and their daughters and their family members. We read some of the narrations that sometimes a woman would be married to more than one person at a time. We have narrations that more than one person would claim to have fathered a child.
There's a saying in pre-Islamic Arabia that says that it is a virtue to bury your daughter alive. Having a daughter was seen as such an unfortunate situation for a family, and men often would bury their daughters alive to take away the shame from them that they had a daughter in their life.
And they named their names of their sons that reflected violence in such a way like to scare the enemy. So you had Sakhar, rock, Harb, war, and so on. They named their sons in this way to encourage that mentality of using violence to gain strength over others.
That was the time in which, and that was the setting in which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam arrives.
And so in this environment, in this heavily racist, prejudiced, sexist, discriminatory environment, came the message of Islam.
The house of Banu Hashim were expecting in their household the birth of a child who will be anointed by God as a prophet. And all the signs pointed to Rasulullah in his childhood.
In Islamic Arabia, the Prophet used to trade items such as clothing and food, and he would go to places as Syria and Yemen and trade items. When people used to trade with the Prophet, they would realize that he would not trick them, nor would he try to get more money for an item than would be lawful.
He was known in Mecca, whenever anyone wanted to travel, they would leave their wealth and possessions in the safekeeping of the Prophet because they knew him to be the most trustworthy person in all of Mecca. He acted almost like a bank for people, somewhere where they could leave their money safely and come back and find it untouched.
In fact, what they used to do is when they would weigh items, if they were weighing food, they would put dust or sand inside the scales to make it weigh more, and they would charge more and give them less items. That is the corruptness of the time in Arabia. However, the Prophet, they noticed that he was so honest that he would give the amount that was due, and he would only take the amount that was due. And so the Arabs, that had no morality in their society, had no acknowledgement of any law of equality, would call him As-Sadiq and Al-Amin. And surely that is a great, great honor that for people that aren't Muslims, that have no idea of any kind of form of morality in society, they are calling you truthful and trustworthy.
Nowhere else could this be found in Mecca. They never heard him lie. They never heard him utter any words that were unbecoming of a noble person.
Prophet Muhammad suggested to his uncle Abu Talib, who loved him so much, that he wanted to trade with the money of Lady Khadija, and Abu Talib agreed to his suggestion. It was his uncle Abu Talib who encouraged him to trade with the money of Lady Khadija by saying to him, "O my nephew, I am a man of no money, and life is difficult for us, and severe years have struck us and left us neither with money nor with trade. These are the caravans of your people, ready to go to Sham, and Khadija sends men to trade with her money and get profits. If you go to her, she will prefer you to all others, because she has been informed about your fidelity and purity."
Khadija was known as the mistress of the women of Quraysh. She had wealth beyond imagination, and many men in pre-Islamic Arabia would use Khadija's money to trade, and that's how her capital became so huge.
She was known that her money gave survival and life and employment to thousands of people. She in herself was an economy. People depended on her for their living.
She had two titles given to her. One was Malikatul Arab, which is the princess of the Quraysh, because she demonstrated the proverbial role, the golden touch. They say that everything that she touched turned to gold. And we find that when trade caravans would leave, her caravan would be equal to all of those of the rest of the people that would be going. She also had the title Tahira, because of her impeccable personality and her virtuous character.
And she was generous, and she was wise, and she was somebody who everybody wished that they were married to.
Bibi Khadija didn't travel with her trade caravans, and as a result she employed agents to go on her behalf.
At the time, Abu Talib said to the Prophet that we do not have a lot of money, so shall I ask Khadija if we can use her money to trade on her behalf, and therefore she will benefit and we will also benefit. The Prophet said to his uncle Abu Talib, as you wish.
And Abu Talib suggested to her that he should employ his nephew Muhammad to go with the trade caravan.
She had heard a lot about the Prophet's status in terms of his titles As-Sadiq and Al-Amin. He was known in the society, so she was more than happy to let the Prophet Muhammad trade on her behalf.
And because these trips were a success, Khadija decided to employ Muhammad again to take another caravan to Yemen. However, all these reports on the character of Muhammad and his personalities and his dealings with the problem with the people, she felt that she had found someone worthy of her. And as a result, she wanted to begin the process of trying to instigate a marriage between herself and Muhammad.
Many men had approached through various advisors and friends to seek the hand of Khadija, and she had refused because she could not find the person who wanted to marry her, not for her money.
She was looking for somebody whom she could trust, not just with her business enterprise, but also with her life, with her programs of charitable works, of caring for the poor, a person who would be like-minded.
And Khadija was so besotted by this man, she knew he was an amazing man, that she sends a proposal to the Prophet to ask her that, will you marry me?
Khadija then calls to speak to Rasulullah. They then go back to speak to their respective uncles, and we find that the marriage between Khadija and Rasulullah takes place.
And so she sought his hand in marriage, and at that time this was something new, that a woman seeks a man's hand in marriage. And the Prophet accepted the marriage, and even though he did not have any wealth of his own, Khadija herself gave the mahar to the Prophet. She gave him 4,000 dinars.
Use this money as my dowry, as my mahar. Use this money to give me on our wedding night.
So when she got married eventually, the person who recited the khutbah, the sermon of the marriage of Rasulullah and Khadija, was none other than Abu Talib. And the opening lines of the sermon were, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds.
We find that Abu Talib delivers the marriage sermon, and it was followed by Nawfal on behalf of Khadija and her uncle.
And all of the people remarked that nobody had seen a wedding like that of Muhammad and Khadija. It was simple yet elegant. It was something that people had never seen before. There were dancers and there was excess in everything. People were drunk and disorderly. There was israf in everything. Yet the wedding of Muhammad was not like that. And the house of Muhammad was not like that.
The marital relation between the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija ﷺ was based on love, kindness and sincerity. It was the best marital life in the whole of Mecca. Khadija was so sincere to the Prophet, and the Prophet found with her all love and care that he had missed because of the death of his parents, whom he had lost since his early childhood. The Prophet used to meditate by visiting the cave of Hira. He spent long times there pondering on the signs of Allah and on all facts in the universe that proved the existence of a great creator.
He would spend lengthy time there thinking and pondering about the different things that he had seen. And it is there that he got the first revelation of Islam.
And Jibreel appeared, according to one tradition, he came with other angels, a contingent of angels arrived, not just. And it was to announce to Rasulullah that now the time had come for you to propagate the message, the one that you have been designated to preach.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم.
Jibreel came to him and says, Iqra, read. And he said, what do I read? And Jibreel says, read these verses of the Quran. And when the Prophet looked around, he could only see Jibreel there. And that's when the first revelation, and he comes down from the mountain and he tells Khadija that, oh Khadija, I have seen something that Jibreel, an angel, has descended to me and told me that I am the Prophet of Islam.
She was the first to accept him as an apostle amongst the women. And the first amongst the male members of the family was Imam Ali himself. The earliest members, the earliest Muslims, for considerable time, they were the one who was seen to be practicing Islam, and i.e. praying in the Kaaba, the way Salat is performed.
So in this oppressive environment, the Prophet starts the message of Islam. And in there, he uses the power of his personality. Before anything, he says to the people of Mecca, before even starting the message, he says to them, if I asked among the people of Mecca, who is the most truthful, who would you say? They said, you, O Muhammad.
Rasulullah then approaches the people of Quraysh and asks them whether they had ever found him to be a man who indulges in false statements or false promises or utters lie. And they said no, because they said, if we suspected that you were a person like us, a person who would indulge in lies and make false statements, we would not have called you, and you were just dishonest, we would not have called you as-Sadiq and al-Amin, the trustworthy and the truthful.
He says to them, if I told you there is an army just behind Jabal Abi Qubays, the small mountain behind us called Abi Qubays, if I told you there was an army behind them, what would you say? They said, we would say you were the truthful, O Rasulullah. We would say there is an enemy behind this mountain. He said, well, if I were to say to you that there is only one God. They said, no, we will not accept this.
When the Prophet brought the teaching of Islam, he brought a teaching of equality, where the rich and poor were now equal. Men and women had an equal status in society. They had different roles, but their status was equal. He gave women the ability to inherit. He told men that marry 4 wives instead of marrying 100 or 200 wives. He gave women the right to an education. He encouraged women to get an education. He encouraged an equal society where people were treated fairly.
The thing that hurt the Quraysh most was that of justice. When he said a woman has a right of inheritance in her father's estate, when he stopped the burial of the female child, and he said a woman has a right of inheritance, when he said a slave is equal to his master, in piety, there's no difference. If there's a pious slave and a pious master, there's no difference in the eyes of God. These things began to hurt. And in the words of the Quraysh, the prominent leader of the Quraysh, they said he is upsetting the social order.
Of course, the men of Arabia were horrified because the Prophet was taking away their rights, taking away the power that they had. Empowering women, empowering slaves now meant that the men of Arabia didn't have the uphold that they had on society. That they would have to let go of that.
So you see, he's really addressing the very heart of the society, and if it was just a belief in one God, I'm sure, as Abu Sufyan said later, if you say believe in one God, we believe in one. You say 10, I don't mind. But no, you are attacking the basis of our society. That's what the complaint of Abu Sufyan was to Rasulullah.
And of course, they hated the Prophet. They wanted to get rid of him. They couldn't believe that somebody would be trying to take away this status that they had built in their society. They were horrified.
But here was a man who's creating upheaval in society, who's giving rights to animals, who's giving rights to women, rights to daughters, who's giving rights to slaves, who's recommending this: buy a slave and free him as a free person, because God created you free and not a slave. So that was the issue that Rasulullah began to encounter when he began to preach Islam.
He would go to the holy mosque, to Al-Kaaba al-Musharrafa, to Al-Masjid al-Haram, and stand there and call people to Islam. He didn't say, join my party, I will give you so-and-so, believe in me, I'll make you my successor, join me and I'll give you shareholdings in my company, I promise you X amount of profits. No. He said, if you join me, I promise you one thing. I promise you salvation in the hereafter. I promise you that what you gain in this life will be multiplied in the hereafter.
He was also maltreated for that. I mean, if he walked through the streets of Mecca, dirt was thrown at him, and he was abused, and he was chased by street urchins. And the person who defended him at the time was Imam Ali, who was in his youth, about 10 to 12 years old, and he would be able to fight off these street urchins and protect Rasulullah.
We know from history that when Imam Ali was born inside the Kaaba, the Prophet after 3 days comes to the Kaaba and the doors of the Kaaba break open, and Fatima bint Asad comes out and she's holding this baby, and the Prophet takes Imam Ali in his hands, and he is the one, and Imam Ali opens his eyes, and the first person that Imam Ali alayhi salam sees is the Prophet. And from that time, Imam Ali and the Prophet's link and their relationship budded.
He raised Ali ibn Abi Talib like a son. Amir al-Mu'mineen says that I would walk behind the Prophet and follow him wherever he went, like the offspring of the camel. Wherever its mother goes, the calf would follow. I was like this with the Prophet. The Prophet would chew food for me when I was an infant and feed me it. The Prophet would hold me by the hand and say, listen to what I have to say. And every day he would educate me and teach me. I learned from the Prophet everything that a person could wish to learn.
Anytime that the Prophet was attacked, Imam Ali would step forward. He was only a young boy at the time, yet he would step forward and protect the Prophet. He would look after him. He was the first one to believe in him. When the Prophet gave the message of Islam, Imam Ali was the first male that said, yes, I believe that you are the Prophet of Islam.
You will not find anywhere in any battle Imam Ali performing a feat that was unjust. On the contrary, there are events where he doesn't strike a person because the person asks for mercy. He overcomes his opponent, but the moment the person asks for mercy, he walks away.
During the marital life of Khadija and Rasulullah, we find that one day Jibreel descends on Rasulullah and he says to him that, O Muhammad, Allah sends his salutations upon you and he commands you to refrain from Khadija for 40 days.
So the Lady Khadija was very upset by this, but she also understood that this is the knowledge of Allah. So the Prophet goes and for 40 days he stays away from Khadija in another house.
And he fasts for 40 days and he prays for 40 nights. During this time, we are told that he stays at the house of Fatima bint Asad, which is the mother of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he sends a message via Ammar Yasir to Bibi Khadija to tell her that his separation is not due to him forsaking her or abandoning her, but it was commanded from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore, as a result of that, they should expect nothing but benevolence from this.
The Prophet, on ascension to the heavens, Al-Mi'raj, when he was called to his Lord to meet with him and to reach that place that nobody else had reached, during that event, the Holy Prophet was given food. And he was presented with heavenly food, and he was told to eat of this specifically.
And we find that it was after the eating of that food and the preparation of the soul through prayer and fast, that it was on that night that we hear of the conception of Sayyidah Fatima. Khadija tells us that she feels the weight of Bibi Fatima in her womb.
So from that time, they knew that Fatima Zahra, she was created from the food of Jannah. She was that pure that Allah gave a special food to the Prophet for her to be created.
And the Prophet and both Khadija were told that this would be Fatima. The name was chosen by Allah.
Fatima comes from the word Fatima, which means to wean, and we find that those who are the believers and followers of Sayyidah Fatima are weaned away from the fires of hell. We find that during the term of pregnancy, Bibi Khadija tells us that she could smell Jannah coming from her. In fact, she even conversed with Bibi Fatima while she was in the womb.
She talks to me, she makes me happy. Tu'nisuni. She speaks to me and comforts me in this difficult time. And so I talk back to the child. And the Prophet would say, what a blessed child this is, that already in the womb of her mother, she is talking to her mother.
When it came to the time of labor, we hear that the midwives of Arabia didn't want to help her. And consequently, she was faced with a dilemma of having to deliver this child on her own.
Nobody else would help Khadija. And so she decided to call out for help. She called and she cried out to Allah to help her in these times. The baby inside her cried, don't worry, O mother, things will go according to Allah's plan. And the narrations say that Khadija was then surrounded by 4 women who announced themselves to her.
We hear that Bibi Hawa, we hear that Bibi Asiya, Bibi Maryam, and Kulthum come down from the heavens, and they help to deliver Sayyidah Fatima in her birth.
And after this event, the Prophet was told, O Prophet, congratulations on the birth of Fatima, your daughter Fatima. And the Prophet took Az-Zahra salamullahi alayha and immediately began her upbringing, immediately began educating Fatima Az-Zahra, not through teaching of books and words, but through the light and the wholesomeness of the akhlaq and moral upbringing of the Prophet, and feeding this into Fatima Az-Zahra so that she would then be able to pass this on to her sons, the holy Imams.